Juliet, good afternoon. I'm so delighted to finally meet you in person. I really enjoyed your books in the 90s about the overworked and the overspent American. Really great mood-lifting reading. I encourage you all to look at it. You have made so many important contributions to how to think about the workplace and how it interfaces with consumption and climate. You've won so many beautiful awards, and I think my favorite award that you received is the George Orwell Award for Distinguished Contributions to Honesty and Clarity in Public Language from the National Council of Teachers of English. Well done, congratulations. So interestingly, since for a number of years, and especially since 2022, you've been involved with trials on the 4-day work week. And you've done one set of trials that you have written up some results about that included, I have to look at it, 61 companies and nearly 3,000 employees. For me, this is like interesting because I grew up in Germany, and in 1992, Volkswagen, who were like in terrible shape at that time, actually switched to a 4-day work week for a long time, where, interestingly, in their case, the implementation was to reduce the hours by 20% and reduce pay by 10 to 15%. So it's like really nice to come back now full circle in a completely different context where people are considering the 4-day work week. So my first kind of question is, let's just for the audience also explain what is the 4-day work week and what has changed and what are the things that stay the same?
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here and wonderful to be able to talk to you all. So we began in February of 2022, and we have been enrolling companies since then. We have now more than over 300 companies and I think over 7,000 employees around the world, starting in Anglophone countries, but now we also have Brazil, Portugal, Germany. A big trial began recently, South Africa. And what these companies are doing is they are giving their employees a 4-day work week. And it's a 32-hour work week typically. There are a few that are doing something slightly different. There are a few that don't go all the way down to 32. There are a few that have a shorter hours per day. But the vast majority are giving people 1 day off with no change in pay. So they're getting their 5 days of pay. And before they start the trial, they go through 2 months of what we call work reorganization, trying to figure out how the organization can get as much productivity and performance in those 4 days as they did in 5. Although, and we can talk about this, in some of these organizations where we're seeing they're coming into this because people are experiencing really high levels of burnout, and they're seeing very big turnover, maybe 50% turnover. I have people calling me saying, we have 100% turnover in this division. It's less about squeezing that amount of work into 4 days because these people are already burned out, and it's just giving people a break. And that's in nursing, for example, restaurants, some of the outside of the white-collar context where that work reorganization is more what's going on.
So just like from a pragmatic perspective, the reorganization, when these companies go from 5 days to 4 days, so this is fewer hours, okay? But then when it comes to what they do less of, what is it that, we talk about the results later, but more like from an implementation side, who decides what they can spend less time on? Is it the employees, the managers, the company?
Yes. So the ideal model and what they get coached to do is to have a bottom-up process in which the teams and employees come together and try and figure out what are we doing that is not valuable? What are we spending time on that isn't really contributing? What's dysfunctional? Where are we wasting time? And really, it tends to be somewhat iterative. There's often a committee that sort of leads the initiative, but they do that work at all levels. One of the companies I've done the most looking at in our trials is Kickstarter, a technology company. And they have changes at every level, and they vary. So you might get, at some levels, they're just doing practically like process engineering. They're going through every step. They're looking at every form that they use and where they can save time. Where you need some organization-wide things often are things like meetings cultures. That's like the one you hear about the most in the press, dysfunctional meeting cultures, where they tighten up meetings, create focus time for people. And many of our companies are small, so that you wouldn't have all those levels.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, and it's very fascinating to hear that it's more of a bottom-up, because there's always economics is called decentralization versus centralization. Decentralized decision-making means that these are people who are closer to the information, but more centralized gives you more scope for coordination, and perhaps employees are perhaps not best suited to choose what they want to spend less time on. So, I just, have you heard, is it like decentralized, so they don't micromanage it, but then the company then steps in if it gets a little bit out of shape?
Yeah, of course. And there is that, it's iterative, I think.
Yeah.
So, and some of them go through elaborate planning processes and others don't. I mean, there are some that just sort of say, make it work. And that's not probably the best way to do it, although in some cases that can work. We've seen also in the nurses' studies, what we've seen is they change the division of labor, and that comes from the top. So they're sort of offloading some tasks to different groups. In the restaurant, that's what they did. They moved some of the tasks of the higher paid people who were getting the 4-day week, the chefs and the managers. The wait staff don't have it yet. But they moved some of their tasks down to lower level employees, which was good also. It built more career sort of ladders within the organization.
Right. And again, we talk about results in a moment, but when you approach these companies or organizations approach you, what are typically big discussion topics when you think about the justification and the implementation of it, and how do you respond to them?
So some come just because they've learned about the results, which have been fantastic, and we'll get to those, and they think it can work in their company, and they're looking at issues of employee well-being. I think increasingly we're seeing a group, and this is where we're expanding to see more healthcare organizations and service sector organizations, where they're experiencing very high levels of resignation and having a hard time filling positions. And this is a very competitive policy for them, and they're reporting back on huge increases in the number of applicants and also quality of applicant pool. So those are the biggest sort of drivers of. But it's been really interesting to me how many. I'm doing interviews with senior managers, and how many of these cases I'm hearing about where what they tell me is the CEO, the founder, read an article about this in the newspaper, and then they came back and said, let's do this.
Yeah, very fascinating, how it goes. So let's talk about the results and how to think about them and what results to look at. And if I may just preface this with a little quote, because I've been thinking about what this means for organizations. I was reminded of an interview that Jane Goodall, the gorilla researcher, did at the New York Times in 2020, where she spoke about animals and humans and how we evolved. And animals are communicating too, but we, and here I quote, we developed this spoken language. We were, for the first time, able to bring people together to discuss a problem. We could teach about things that weren't present with language, and I think that triggered this explosive development about intellect that's taken us to the moon, to Mars. So, put it differently, how should we think about the workplace where you think it is better not to spend too much time at it?
Yeah. So let me let me first tell you about some of the basic results
Yes.
we've had, and then I'll get to that question, which is a really great one, very important. So we have two kinds of data collection that we're doing. One is that we are surveying employees before the trial begins. We have what's called a within subjects methodology, so we're following the same people. Then we have a short survey at 3 months and also a time diary to find out what they're doing on their off day. The trials are technically 6 months, so we survey again at 6 months. Then at 12 months, a short survey on some of the basic findings, and then we just have put our 24-month into the field now. So we're going to keep, following these as long as we can to see how durable the results are. Huge well-being improvements. We have 26 measures, probably a bit of overkill, but burnout. In our global samples, I think something like 68% of employees are registering reductions in burnout, about 40% on stress, anxiety, fatigue, reduction in sleep problems, increases in sleep, more exercise, self-reported better physical and mental health, positive on all the satisfaction questions, negative emotions down, positive emotions up, you kind of name it. Very, very high preference for the 4-day week, over 90% among the employees, and very high willingness to pay to keep a 4-day week. So lots of great, great employee stuff. Our company metrics are much less rigorous because we have lots of small companies, as I said, where they're just reporting to us. But I've got the U.S. numbers, U.S.-Canada numbers in my mind because I testified to the Senate on this yesterday, so I'll give you those. I don't remember on the global. Absenteeism down by, I think, 39%, resignations down 22.5%, revenue up 30%. But I think those are not like really hard numbers. I think the number to pay attention to on the company side is 91%, and that is the fraction of companies who continue after 1 year. We've got about 9% who revert to 5%, so it's working for them. A lot of them say productivity is higher or the same. We don't have real productivity measures. We can get into that. It's a really important question. But I think the point I want to make about this that really surprised me is not that a 4-day week benefits workers in terms of all these well-being. I mean, yes, okay, it's great. And we sort of expected that. And it's that one of the big findings we have from the employee data is that their self-reports of productivity soar. And we have a number of metrics. One is, what is your current workability compared to your lifetime best? What is your productivity? We have a smart working scale. All of those go up a lot. And what we find in our model, our well-being model, is that's one of the biggest mediators through the reduction in working hours for well-being increases. So these are actually so tied, not just that the firm is better off when its employees are better off, which everyone in this room will attest to that. I mean, you're experts in that. But that being more productive makes the workers better off. And that's what I didn't expect. And it's really interesting. So these two things are linked in a way I did not understand before we got into this.
Yeah, this is really fascinating. And because when you think, we spend less time there, and perhaps it's related to what kind of companies wanted to work with you or participate in these trials, but intuitively when I think, I don't have as many hours as before. And may I just think back to the Volkswagen example? The middle managers there, they reported that the workplace is competitive. It's a tournament. You get promoted by being better than the next person. So actually, many of them resorted to taking work home to continue with the rat race. So for some of them, this led to more stress. And here, it's a bit of a hybrid question. I mean, Ed Lazier very importantly showed us with a Safe Life study that when we make changes to incentives, this leads to behavioral but also compositional effects. So it changes the behavior of some people, but it might lead some people to leave, and it attracts new types of workers. So do you have a sense of how this result was changed by a change in the composition of the workplace?
Yeah. No, we don't have any data on that. I did rare cases. I did one interview with a guy who was he didn't reduce his work hours because he's one of those hard-charging types. But he did appreciate the fact that while he was still working on Friday, he didn't have to work on Saturday anymore. So I understand there are some of those. But, I didn't answer your question about the Jane Goodall and sort of what's going on in the workplace.
Yeah.
So a couple of thoughts about that. Some of the companies get very intentional about building in collaborative time and so forth. So they organize special times when they're together. I think the shift to hybrid and remote is much more important for this interaction in the workplace because really here we're just losing one of the 5 days. But what's interesting is I think one of the things you talked about with Volkswagen is there less time to be creative and innovative and get new ideas and so forth. And we now have introduced a creativity scale. We just put it in, and the first wave is just retrospective, but there's an increase in self-reported on a creativity scale. We're not seeing increased pace of work and speed up. Fascinating. We expected that because if that's right, it means that work reorganization is working. So they're just getting rid of wasted time. And some of the organizations are telling us they're just getting a lot more strategic and being they call it prioritizing what they're doing. And what some of them tell us is that helps them to have that process that you're talking about. Right. So they're actually having more time to step back and think about what they're doing, which is, of course, counterintuitive. We wouldn't have expected
Very
that.
much so, yeah, because for me, what makes the people productive in modern workplaces is the ability to establish new relationships, and especially creating weak ties that gives them access to new information and better enforcement of collaboration. And the other part is that, we have this problem of what is called irreducible complexity. So we have to constantly do complex works. And initially I thought, well, perhaps then these people just don't do any of those things that would require relationships or complexity. But what you're saying here, which is interesting, they're more attentive and more purposeful, and then they actually, seek out those strategic relationships more.
Yeah. But also remembering, these are small companies,
Sure.
So it's sort of, in some ways, the relationships are just more present. And yeah, we'd love more big companies.
Yeah. So here, we spoke about this in the break before. It's so hard to get pilots started, especially on an innovative approach. And I'm just like in awe that you have been able to pull this off so vastly. But of course, just from a boring methodological point, there's a selection issue. But more interestingly, do you see this as something that provides a competitive advantage to some companies? Or is it something that we should think about as a generalized policy recommendation for broad markets?
Yeah, I really think it needs to spread. So it definitely is giving a competitive advantage to the early adopters. And maybe if it doesn't spread, they'll have that. But I think particularly as we look at the future with AI coming into the workplaces in a big way, we're going to have big productivity increases. Hopefully. Yeah. And I think it's reasonable to expect that. And so we have to ask the question, what do we do with that productivity increase? Do we use it to give people more free time, or do we just increase output and create more aggregate income, which at the moment is flowing almost all to the very top. And this is what a lot of the Senate hearing was about yesterday. But In the United States, less so in some of the other countries that we're working with, but also in the Anglophone countries, which are the first group in our studies, we have not had a reduction in average working hours in many decades. And there is extreme time poverty in this country, time squeeze, as we have a big increase in dual learner households with kids. And so this is why these well-being impacts are there, in part, I think, because as we heard from a number of people in our studies, 2 days is not enough.
Right.
The weekend is not enough because people are doing all the work of maintaining households, as well as many of them have 2 full-time jobs.
Yeah, so I see, I could talk for hours about a lot of things, including gorillas. So one, you see that they have done less of some things, and this goes to one of the questions that came up here: what problems the 4-day work week trying to solve? So, for instance, I'm being a bit flippant, but if they say, we spend less time on unproductive meetings, well, if that's the problem, why is a 4-day work week the answer to that, right? So, what problems is it trying to resolve? So, you seem to suggest that these are people, especially those who have a sense of burnout, who are just like a little bit at sea in the workplace, and they need more time off to re-energize. But what other problems do you see that the 4-day work week is particularly amenable to resolve? So
time squeeze and stress, and the pandemic really exacerbated this. I've been working on these issues for decades, and it's just taken off since the pandemic. So that's number one. Resignations and inability to attract. That's from the company point of view. The 4-day week as a forcing mechanism, because it's forcing companies to sort of look at the ways in which they're not being strategic or they're not using time most valuably. And as I'm always asking in my interviews, well, why couldn't you do this with a 5-day week? Why do you need a 4-day week? Of course, economists would always ask that question. And one of my respondents said something. I said, why don't you get that efficient functionality? And she said, have you ever known a company that was efficient and functional? She said, we're just trying to keep our heads above water.
Yeah. So one question that comes up here also about what do they do on the 5th day when they're not at work? Are they hanging out with their children, learning another language, starting a charity, or are they actually having a side gig at the same time? What do you think?
No side gigs. That was one other thing I most thought of, especially in the U.S. No increase in second job holding at all in any of our trials. Fascinating. And also the results for the off day are really similar across the globe. The biggest thing is leisure, hobbies, like me time.
Yeah.
That's number one. We do have 60% of our respondents are women, but that's what they're doing. Number 2 is domestic work, housework, and childcare. And number 3 is personal grooming. And that's like, as one said, now I can get a pedicure guilt-free. So there's that, they're doing that. On average, 1 hour of work on the off day, and that's I think from the interviews, some of the senior managers don't get that day off, but they do free up their nights and weekends. And some of the companies that have tweaked their programs, and that's an important thing too, they tweak them as they get experience. So there is an iterative dimension to this to make sure it works. Some of them have some on-call availability, so if there are things that are ongoing, not all companies take the same day off, so it doesn't hold back progress on work that's being done.
Yeah, I mean, just as a plug, I think it would be really important to look at consumption of these employees, because if they have more time off work, do they actually then consume more, and which might actually give them some financial constraints. But there are 2 more questions here. One is a pragmatic one. The companies, did they roll it out in a staggered fashion to make sure that there's always people in the company, or how did they do that?
It very much depends. I like to say they're like snowflakes, everyone different, and then one of our team members said to me, don't use that word. It's like everyone thinks it's such a bad thing now. But Some have, they need to maintain 5-day coverage. They have rotating teams. Some just, they close the whole day Friday. Some pick Wednesday. Apparently in Texas, Wednesday is the day that people take off. I'm not sure why, so it gives you that break in the middle of the weekend, but lots of variation.
Yeah. I know that your study in Britain was for relatively short terms. Of course, I'm sure you want to look at longer term effects, and that is an interesting. And here, related to, I'm compressing two questions here. Is the one thing that people often suffer from is that they always feel the pressure that they need to be available, reachable. And when they are working for 4 days, do they also see that they can really be unplugged for 3 days? And is this something that remains? So after a while, does it creep in that they get emails on their quote-unquote off day again?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. The follow-up studies we're doing are on the well-being and not... And the answer to the first part is it depends. So some of the people who are very client-facing will tell the clients, you can contact me in an emergency. And some, as I said, in some of these companies, they do create some requirement to be available, although one of the companies has a dual policy. If you want to book it as a day when you have zero availability, you have a certain number of Fridays that you're allowed to do that, and the other ones you have to be available to answer a call if they need you. So it's very variable. Yeah. Key point here is that every one of these organizations has to figure out what's going to work for them, and that there seems to be a lot of variation.
Yeah, this is fantastic. I hope someone here in the audience has $100 million to give you so you can do more research on this. Juliet, very much appreciate your time, and thank you very much for coming here.
Thank you.